$130 billion. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. It is a staggering number, right? But what makes this figure truly fascinating isn't just the sheer size of it, it's actually where it sits. So how exactly does a nonprofit charity legally transform into a massive private company holding $130 billion in equity, all without actually giving its assets away? Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because we are about to unravel one of the most complex and honestly most consequential legal mysteries in modern corporate history. We're looking at OpenAI's massive corporate conversion. And we're not just looking at it as a savvy business move, but really as a forensic examination of centuries-old charitable law. Because what they did, it literally redefined what a nonprofit can become. All right, let's dive right in. Here is our roadmap for today's legal forensic investigation. We'll cover the divestiture playbook, then the control retention model, clearing the 3 tripwires, the valuation problem, the regulators, and finally, the precedent set. Starting with Section 1, the divestiture playbook, or how charities became companies before all this happened. So for decades, there was a really established, proven way to turn a charity into a company. It was heavily utilized in the 1990s healthcare industry, and it's called divestiture. It's best to think of it like a clean divorce. The charity sells its assets at an independently appraised fair market value. Those proceeds then go on to endow a completely independent foundation with a similar mission. And the charity completely exits the for-profit company. The severance itself is the protection. The charitable value leaves the for-profit's control entirely, which ensures the new foundation answers to absolutely no one but its mission. To put that into perspective, look at the contrast here. Back in the 90s, when Blue Cross of California converted, they used that divestiture model. They extracted over $3 billion in cash and stock, and they handed it right over to independent stewards, specifically 2 completely independent foundations. But fast forward to OpenAI's 2025 conversion, they used what's called a control retention model. They retained roughly $130 billion in equity internally. They didn't cash out and hand the value to an independent steward. Nope, they kept it, the whole shebang. Which brings us to Section 2. The control retention model. Essentially, what OpenAI did instead, the departure here is structurally profound. The old playbook, as we just saw, relied heavily on severance and proceeds. But OpenAI's playbook, it relies on entanglement and equity. Instead of separating the charity from the for-profit to protect it, this new model does the exact opposite. It binds them together. Under the structure finalized in October 2025, the nonprofit, now called the OpenAI Foundation, didn't sell its assets and exit. It actually kept roughly $130 billion in equity, and it continues to govern the for-profit OpenAI Group PBC. Now, to be completely impartial here, there really is a genuine both sides read of this situation. On one hand, you could definitely argue this is a brilliant mission-protective innovation. I mean, a foundation with a $130 billion stake, steering a company, building artificial general intelligence, it stays in the game, with influence a cashed-out foundation just wouldn't have. But on the other hand, a nonprofit that controls the very for-profit it depends on for its value, that is structurally entangled in exactly the way old charity rules were built to prevent. Okay, let's move to Section 3, clearing the 3 tripwires. We're getting into the tax law rules now. You see, any nonprofit conversion has to clear 3 massive legal tripwires just to survive. The old healthcare playbook cleared all 3 by simply divesting. But OpenAI had to clear them while maintaining control, which, as you can imagine, is a way trickier path to navigate. Tripwire number 1 is the asset lock. This is a centuries-old charitable trust doctrine stating that a nonprofit's assets are permanently dedicated to its charitable purpose. You absolutely cannot just hand them over to private investors. So how did OpenAI slip past this? Well, they kept the assets nominally locked inside the foundation structure, while simultaneously making them economically operative inside the for-profit as equity. It's a hybrid approach that the original doctrine was, frankly, never written to address. Tripwire number 2 is private inurement. This is the strict rule forbidding any of a charity's value from benefiting private individuals, like founders or insiders. Naturally, a control retention structure really strains this rule. When you have a foundation controlling a for-profit, especially one where the equity holders include employees and private investors, you really have to ask, is charitable value flowing into private hands? On paper, the structure is designed to say no, the foundation holds the controlling value. But that deep entanglement, that is exactly what inurement rules were originally built to scrutinize. Let's look at Section 4, the valuation problem. Or in other words, what exactly is a mission worth? So the absolute crucial point here revolves around that staggering $130 billion figure. In a traditional conversion, fair market value is proven pretty simply by an independent appraisal and a cash sale. But here, $130 billion is a private equity mark. It moves with the company's own internal valuation funding rounds. It's not an independent, arm's-length measure of what the public is actually owed. Because the foundation holds equity in a company, it also controls. The buyer and the seller are essentially the exact same governance structure. This prompted critics, like the advocacy group Public Citizen, to call the nonprofit little more than a rubber stamp of the for-profit. The fair value test is massively strained here, guys, because there really is no arm's-length sale when the controlling parent is valuing its very own intertwined stake. Which brings us to Section 5, the regulators. Blessing rather than testing. The designated enforcers of charitable law are the state attorneys general. Back in December 2024, California actually began investigating OpenAI, citing the fact that its assets were irrevocably dedicated to charity. But by October 2025, both California's and Delaware's attorneys general blessed the recapitalization. So you might be wondering, why the sudden settlement? Well, fast forward to October 2026. That was the deadline for a $6.6 billion funding round. If they didn't convert, they faced massive clawbacks with a 10% interest penalty attached. So there was immense financial pressure to settle this quickly rather than engage in a lengthy court battle. Now, what's really interesting here is what this whole timeline reveals about enforcement. These regulators absolutely had the standing, the resources, and the jurisdiction to challenge this and actually set the law in court. Instead, they settled. They accepted the representation, the paper version, that nonprofit control is preserved. They essentially blessed the structure without demanding a legal adjudication to test if that control is actually real in practice. And finally, Section 6, the precedent set. Let's talk about the impact on future charities. Historically, the asset lock was viewed as a permanent wall. Assets given to a charity stayed dedicated to charity forever, period. But this new precedent tests whether that promise actually survives contact with an asset valuable enough to make breaking it worth the legal effort. If this precedent holds up, that asset lock basically becomes a turnstile. A charity could just become a tax-advantaged staging ground for whatever later proves lucrative. To summarize this honestly chilling new reality, charitable assets can now migrate into private equity-style structures. No divestiture is required. Equity simply flows right back to the nonprofit. The nonprofit nominally retains control, and the whole thing was settled by regulator acquiescence, not court adjudication. This means nonprofit could just become a temporary status, one that ends the second the founders decide the asset has gotten big enough. But remember, the entire protection of this model rests on a single, highly contested fact. Is the nonprofit's control real, or is it merely nominal? And the thing is, we won't know the answer to that from settlement documents. So I'm going to leave you with this to think about. What happens the first time the foundation's charitable mission and the massive for-profit company's financial interests genuinely conflict? That right there is the $130 billion experiment currently running. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep asking the hard questions,